Hey everyone, welcome back to Hard4Games. I'm your host Tony, and today we have what might be one of my most favorite items we've ever featured on the show. It is an Ultra 64 controller, not a Nintendo 64, Ultra 64. Before Nintendo's 64-bit machine had its retail name, the N64, it was known as the Ultra 64, and it had the sleek black branding and logo, and it had so much mystique for me as a kid, and I kind of wish they could have kept that name, although I have no problem with the N64. As you know, I'm a big fan. Oh, the Ultra 64. Oh, so beautiful. So anyways, thank you to for sending this all the way from Australia so I could kind of get to know it, just feel the energy of my childhood Ultra 64 branding memories come back to me. Big thank you, sir, and let's go ahead and get into it.
This is Hard4Games. They're Hard4Games. They become hard. They're Hard4Games.
Alright, so as a reminder, here's what the classic retail N64 controller looks like. You all remember this. Take a gander at it. And here is what the prototype controller looks like. So notice it's very sleek, jet black coloring here. It's even darker than the black N64 retail controller, which kind of sits somewhere between black and a very dark gray. Still black, but this is just much darker to go along with the whole Ultra 64 aesthetic and branding. Now, there are many differences here, and I'm going to kind of break them all down. First of which is this large area at the top, which I always thought they'd utilize for a jewel, like you'd have on top of a GameCube, like a jewel. As a kid, I assumed that the Ultra 64 logo would go in here, and I think I convinced myself that it did, because I thought I remembered seeing promotional material with it saying Ultra 64 right here, and this is kind of the shape of the logo on the N64, but I think I created a false memory, because looking back at promotional material, all it said was just Nintendo across the top here, just like the retail version does. It says Nintendo. So that would make sense. Again, I think it was a false memory, but it would have been pretty cool if it said Ultra 64 right here. Now, Shane had pointed out that when you look closely at the promo materials, you can see folds at the top corners of where it says Nintendo. So chances are that, at least in that photo, was probably just a sticker that they quickly knocked out and slapped on for that particular photo with the intention of actually doing a true Nintendo labeling within the plastic once it went to retail. So obviously there are a ton of color differences here, which we're just going to go ahead and ignore and talk about the buttons and layout and size differences instead. But if you look closely, probably the biggest difference here is the joystick. The joystick on the prototype controller is much larger. Totally different design, and the thumb pad here is much bigger. There's an indent for your thumb as well. However, it doesn't have the rings that the retail version has, and this is sort of a sleek plastic. It's not rubberized at all. So, as a result, it's sort of much slipperier. I feel like, I mean, yeah, you can play it without your thumb slipping off, but since there aren't any grips, I feel like if they would have gone to retail with this thumb pad, people would have complained that it was a little bit too slippery. That said, if this was rubberized or had, grips on it or whatever, I do think I would have preferred a joystick like this. It's just a little bit meatier. I also think that due to its larger surface area, people wouldn't have injured themselves at Mario Party as much. Injured themselves. Now, the interior of the joystick is different as well. Now, I wouldn't dare take this thing apart myself, but Shane did. He's much more mechanically inclined than I am, and there are only about 2 or 3 of these that may exist in the world currently, out of all of the few that were made to begin with. So here are the pictures that he took of the interior mechanisms of the joystick. Again, I have images of the inside, but I am not messing with it myself because I would never forgive myself if I messed it up. Moving on to the other buttons here, we're going to take a look at the A and B buttons. For some reason, on the prototype, the A and B buttons are indented right, whereas the A and B buttons are indented left on the retail controller. I'm not 100% sure why they did this, if there was some sort of aesthetic reason, but alas, they did. Maybe it was to separate these from the C buttons. I'm not 100% sure, even though it's just sort of separating them visually. Now, the C buttons here are also not labeled C, they're just arrows, and they're also missing the circle that sort of encapsulates all of the C buttons to let the player know that these are all C buttons. I.e. like this, right? So you know these are all C buttons, there's the circle here, this is missing that. Also, this is truly more of a circle, whereas this kind of reminds me more of, you know, this being a line, this being a line, kind of your A, B, X, Y from your SNES. These seem more at an angle and less of like a circle. Continuing with the face buttons here, the start button is a little bit more raised and a little bit less clicky. That's kind of a theme here. The buttons are a bit spongier. Same goes with the D-pad. I wouldn't say that this D-pad is clicky by any stretch, but it's definitely a little spongier on the prototype controller. Flipping it over here, the L and R buttons are a lot shallower. They protrude less than the retail version. They're also not quite as long. They're just a little bit shorter in the prototype version. And clicking these here, they're a little bit spongier than retail. These are just a little bit clickier. I mean, not a ton. Just a little bit different feeling. And again, notice how the L and R buttons are visible above the controller here. Whereas here, you can kind of see a little bit of a lip of the L and R buttons, but then it kind of dives inward. Fully reversing it, we have the Z button here, which is not labeled Z. For the sake of memory, here's the Z button on the retail pad, which feels more like you're pulling a trigger. Overall size is a bit different as well. So for example, the arms are a touch longer on the prototype. The left and right arms seem a little bit longer, slightly, possibly, but the center arm or leg or whatever you would call this thing is definitely longer. It fits a lot better in my adult hand compared to the traditional N64 controller, but I never complained about the size of this thing as a child. I think I was in middle school when this thing came out. So Nintendo was probably, you know, thinking about their target demographic, which was skewed younger, so they probably shortened this up a little bit just to make sure it fit their hands. Now, for those of you that want a full teardown of this beautiful beast, I'm going to show some images right now. Again, I don't feel comfortable opening this thing up, but he does, and he did, and took some amazing photos, so here they are. Now lastly, and you probably noticed already, the controller input is an RJ11 connector, i.e. the connector of your old landline phones, although it's only utilizing 3 out of the 4 available wires here. So that leads us to what this thing is supposed to actually plug into, and I'm going to hand that part over to explain the N64 Development Environment in depth, and also showcase this controller in action, at least as far as he's been able to get it to function so far.
Thanks Tony, and hi everybody. Today I'd like to take you through the initial Nintendo 64 development hardware, called the Ultra 64 Development Board, which was designed to fit inside an SGI indie workstation. Early versions of U64 boards, such as this one, shipped with prototype controllers bearing the RJ11 type connector. These could connect directly into the controller ports on the back of the board. Later versions, such as this Rev 2.0 U64 board, would utilize a Joybus adapter, referred to as a modular N64 controller connector in the documentation. These allowed up to 4 retail-style controllers to interface with the development board. These boards are also noted for a spelling error in their silkscreen. You can find various versions of the installation and setup instructions for this hardware. The Nintendo 64 programming manual is available in both a scanned document format from as early as '96, as well as a later HTML format off the SDK. Installation of the hardware involves opening the Indie workstation and inserting the U64 board into the GIO headers of the graphics board. A neat feature about the Indie is that it natively supports video playback and capture via a standard composite connection. The video control app displays a live video stream from this input, meaning you can view a sort of picture-in-picture of your game within a window while it's running off the U64 board. Video output from the Indy is by default 13W3, but adapters are available to convert to a VGA D-sub connector. I use a 13W3 to VGA cable with dip switches set to support the required HV sync out mode of the Indy. The top left button on the Indy powers it on. During the normal startup process, you'll see this LED change colour and a sort of musical jingle will sound. All going well, the power up boot monitor will echo U64 device found. If this doesn't occur, you'll need to shut down the system, investigate the cause, and try again. Without this notification, the U64 board will be inaccessible to software. Silicon graphics workstations are unique machines with an equally unique operating system called IRIX, a Unix-based OS. In the case of N64 Dev, this is usually IRIX version 5.3. Some images that will need to be installed before working with the U64 board include gload, which loads ROM images into the U64, the Game Shop debugger called GVD for debugging, as well as the debugging interface program called dbgif. The SDK includes sample source code demonstrating various graphics, sound, and other features, which you can compile with the make command and run with gload. So far I've been demoing sample programs off my Rev 2.0 board with a retail controller. But let's briefly go back to my version 1.0 board and the prototype controller. Now unfortunately, I haven't had a lot of time to explore this package yet, and I'm yet to use its thumbstick. The controller itself is incompatible with the Rev 2.0 board, and the Rev 2.0 installation and sample ROMs are incompatible with the version 1.0 board. I do, however, have a small number of working sample ROMs on this installation. One is Tron, which I can demo here utilizing the L and R shoulder buttons and start button of the prototype controller. Another notable feature of my Rev 2.0 U64 board is its ability to run full retail ROMs, which I haven't been able to achieve with the 1.0 board and proto controller yet. Again, I'm uncertain of the basis for this, and it's possibly operator error, but I'll finish by demonstrating some games off the 2.0 now. Just quickly before I go on, let's look at one of the graphics demos built into IRIX. Now this is a Silicon graphics demo, unrelated to Nintendo, but you can see how it would later influence the menu of Mario 64. Let's take a look at some more Nintendo 64 games. It's kind of fascinating to think that back in the day, this kind of view is what developers for the N64 platform were using. In the mid-90s, this was really cutting-edge stuff. Well, that's about it from me for today. I'd like to thank Gerry O'Brien, my buddy in Canada, for his help in preparing one of the SD hard drive clones that I've been using in this footage. His channel will be linked to this video. Also, I've written instructions on how to back up an Indy hard drive using a SCSI to SD adapter, which is a great idea if you ever come across an original system with or without a U64 board just for preservation purposes. A link to download these instructions will be provided. So with that, till next time, thanks, and back to you, Tony.
So there you have it, an Ultra 64 controller, the Indy SGI workstation, an Ultra 64 board within that workstation, all of those details. Thank you so much to controller all the way from Australia. I no longer have to wait for the Ultra 64 like I have been all of my life. If you want to check Shane out, I'm gonna go ahead and put his handle on screen. Oh yeah, is that true? She's looking at her mom over there. My wife's working. She's like, Mommy, hold me instead of Dad. What are all these lights? Anyways, if you
about the Ultra 64.
the Ultra 64 is so good. What was I saying? If you want to check him out on Twitter. He just posts about all of his various projects. A lot of really in-depth stuff. If you're interested, he can go further in depth than I can on a lot of these things. He's also working on a project called the 64 Mate, which is a housing for your upscalers, capture equipment, cords, etc. for your N64, and it looks really nice, like a 64 disk drive, but it's not. Also, a big thank you to Gerry for being a resource on this particular episode regarding the Indy workstation, and also just being a friend of the show for quite some time and helping me out with a lot of N64 related stuff. So big thank you. He runs Behind the Code, which is a YouTube channel. I'm going to put a link in the description below. Again, he goes way in depth in terms of development hardware. So if that's what you're interested in, definitely check him out, because again, he can go further in depth than I can by far. So thank you again for watching, everyone. We'll see you all next time.